Okay, recording resumes. This is still August 6th. Okay, let's do these two practice problems. We're on a time crunch, so let's crunch them. All right? Here we go. An individual with the genotype heterozygous A, heterozygous B, heterozygous E, homozygous dominant H is crossed with an individual who is homozygous recessive A, heterozygous B, heterozygous E, homozygous recessive H. What is the likelihood of having an offspring with this genotype? Heterozygous A, homozygous recessive B, homozygous dominant E, heterozygous H. Let's go through, and first, since you see that genotype would be impossible is an option, let's make sure the genotype is actually possible. Okay? Could the individual be heterozygous for A? Yes. Could they be homozygous recessive for B? Yes. Homozygous dominant for E? Yes. Heterozygous for H? Yes. Awesome. Oh, geez. This is great. Now let's go ahead and calculate the probability of this genotype. Now remember, we're going to be assuming all of these are inherited separately from one another. So we just need to calculate the probability of each genotype, and then add them all together, right? Because, multiply them all together. My bad, right? Each one we calculate it and we multiply them together because we're asking what is the probability of getting this genotype and this and this and this. Cool? So the first one, homozygous or heterozygous for A. Well, what's the probability of receiving a dominant allele from this parent? 1/2. What's the probability of receiving a recessive allele from this parent? 100% or 1. So the probability of this one happening is 0.5 times 1 or 0.5. What's the probability of homozygous recessive? Well, what's the probability of receiving a recessive allele here? 1/2. And here? 1/2. So 1/4, 0.25. Probability of it being homozygous dominant. Well, what's the probability of receiving a dominant allele here? Here? 0.25. Probability of being heterozygous for H. What's the probability of receiving a dominant allele here? Recessive allele here? This individual will 100% be heterozygous for H. The probability of receiving this total genotype, this is also 1/2 times 1/4 times 1/4 times 1, all right, or 1/32. Yes, question? Sorry, was that, no? On the H's? Yeah, so check it out. This individual is going to receive a dominant allele from this parent. Therefore, the probability of receiving a dominant allele is 1. The probability of receiving a recessive allele is 1, because you will receive it from this parent. This is when we're taking it, I'm kind of removing some steps and just doing it with just pure, it's not pure reasoning, but it's pure math. It's not pure anything. It's math and reasoning. Combining the two together, and with that, you can do anything. That's corny, yeah.
Could you go over the A's again?
The A's? Absolutely. So what's the probability of receiving a dominant allele from one of the parents? Because remember, these are two events, right? You need to know the probability of getting a dominant allele and the probability of getting a recessive allele. The probability of getting a dominant allele from this parent is 0.5. The probability of getting a recessive allele from this parent is 1, all right? There are other things that could happen, but there's only one way that you can get this genotype. The only way to get this genotype is by receiving a dominant allele here and a recessive allele here. You're probably thinking about, oh, there's a recessive allele there too, right? But we don't care about that outcome, because if that happened, you would be homozygous recessive for that gene. So I'm eliminating certain combinations just rapid fire. Awesome. Imagine the cross of two triple heterozygous pea plants. Okay? Here's a trick. These plants have tall stems and axial purple flowers. They are triple heterozygous. So they are heterozygous for each of those alleles. What's the dominant allele?
Tall stems and axial purple flowers.
Yep, tall stems, axial flowers, and purple flowers. Okay? So in the exam, I shouldn't have to tell you tall is dominant to short because I show you the genotype and I give you the phenotype. Reasonable enough? All right, it requires that you got all the pieces. So using only the rules of probabilities, what proportion of offspring will have dwarf stems and axial purple flowers? So what we're saying is, what proportion will be homozygous recessive for T and homozygous dominant or heterozygous for A and homozygous dominant or heterozygous for P, right? But it's like, sure, I could write it all out, or you know how a monohybrid cross works. You've seen them already. What proportion of offspring are going to be homozygous recessive for T? 1/4. What proportion are going to be dominant phenotype for A?
Half? No.
3/4. What proportion will be dominant phenotype for P? 3/4. Okay? So you could do it as, which proportion is going to be homozygous dominant or heterozygous, which would be 1/4 plus 1/2, right? Or you can just use your knowledge of monohybrid crosses. Question? They're triple heterozygous pea plants. What's that? Sorry. No. They are quarters instead of they're usually quarters because we're thinking about it as a Punnett square, right? It's quarters. Yeah. The only time we ever have halves when we're talking about like heterozygote phenotypes. You know what I mean? Yeah. We're talking about quarters because I'm talking about the rules of a monohybrid cross for each one. The idea here is that you're doing a monohybrid cross for each characteristic. You don't have to write a Punnett square that tracks every possible gamete that could be produced because none of these genes are linked. They're all inherited separately. So they're all independent events. So the probability of being of this, and this, all right, means that you determine the probability of each and then multiply them, right? This and this and this. Question?
Would it not be the sum because there's multiple versions?
No. It would be, though, if we're trying to determine specifically the probability of axial flowers. All right? I'll do a Punnett square just because it's a visualization aid. All right? Axial, not axial, right? Dominant, heterozygous, recessive. Okay? So what I'm doing is I'm just being like, okay, well, it's a monohybrid cross. 3/4 of them will have the dominant phenotype. Or you could say this, right? What's the probability? This question here is actually the probability of homozygous dominant or heterozygous. So in this case, that's 1/4 plus 2/4 equals 3/4.
So because it's asking for phenotype, not...
Yeah, when we're asking for phenotypes, you're usually using the product rule because there are multiple ways that a phenotype can happen. There are multiple genotypes that can lead to the same phenotype, you see. And these are also two independently possible outcomes. Question, please.
Well, just like to make it super simple, we're summing all of the genotype possibilities that make a specific phenotype and then making a product of all those
We are summing all the genotype possibilities that make a certain phenotype and then getting the product of each one of those phenotypes probabilities. Is that a fair rephrasing of, or just a recapitulation or repeating of what you said?
Yeah.
Awesome. I wanted it for the recording because that's very succinct. Very good. Yes? Only if you're doing hybrid cross. Yep. Remember think about the phenotypic ratio, which is always a 3-to-1 phenotypic ratio of 3 dominant to 1 recessive phenotype when you're doing a hybrid cross. All right? Because 1 out of 4 individuals will be homozygous dominant, 2 out of 4 will be heterozygous. That's 3 out of 4, 3-to-1 ratio. Yeah. It's a lot of stuff coming at you, you know. Was there another hand up? Yes.
Just to clarify this one, this would be C, right? Like we're using the multiplication ones.
Yeah, 1/4 times 3/4 times 3/4 equals 9 out of 64.
Something excess of 1 would make sense for E anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, that's a weird way to say that.
No worries. No worries. Okay, cool. Yeah, this one makes 0 sense at all. If you answered that on an exam, I'd be like, okay. It's okay to not get this stuff too. All right, so that's our probability talk. That's the heaviest piece for today, all right? Because it requires you understand this math. But once you understand this math, you can see it in your life, all right? You can make decisions based on how likely outcomes are. And you can recognize when things that you see occurring around you were incredibly unlikely. And that feels really good, you know? If you play a lot of dice games and you're playing Yahtzee and you roll 5 6s at once, you're like, oh my gosh, that was cool. Or you can be like, the odds of that happening are 1/6 times 1/6 times 1/6 times 1/6 times 1/6. It's crazy, you know? It's very unlikely. Y'all like Yahtzee? It's really fun. It's really a good time. What? You don't play it? You don't like it? You love Yahtzee. You know, it's also called Yacht Dice. That was the non-trademarked version of it. There was a game called Yacht Dice, and a company was like, let's call it Yahtzee and trademark it and sell it. Isn't that fun? Okay. We're still talking complex patterns of inheritance. All right, we got to get through X-linked characters. We can get there. We have 35 minutes remaining. All right. Sometimes multiple genes determine a phenotype. So for example, there are a bunch of different genes that are involved in determining height. All right? There are multiple genes involved in determining eye color. There are multiple genes involved in determining skin color. When you see a characteristic that doesn't fall into like a dominant and a recessive phenotype, or maybe like a dominant, a heterozygous, and a recessive phenotype, you might be looking at polygenic inheritance, where it's actually a slew of genes, a suite of genes that are all involved in this. Okay? Here we've got an image that has not really aged perfectly well of world leaders and how they range in their heights. All right? It's, you know, there's some stuff there, but let's just not dwell on that image. Anyway, polygenic inheritance. More than one gene is involved in determining the phenotype. Fair? Of course, it's going to be super complicated. Sometimes a genotype, all right, is expressed differently based on the environment. So your phenotype isn't entirely determined by your genotype. You know, there are like, depending on what you get exposed to, say in your environment, in the womb, all these different things, you can develop a very different physical expression of the genotype. Fair enough? Sometimes your phenotype isn't really genetically based, right? Like in this example of hydrangea flowers. Hydrangea flowers grown at a high pH or at a basic pH are pink. Hydrangea flowers grown at an acidic pH in the soil are blue. So, you know, people will, this happens all the time, it's fun, it's funny, people will like order hydrangeas and be like, I wanted the blue ones and you sent me the pink ones, and it's like, no, you got hydrangeas, all right? You gotta do something to make the soil more acidic if you want, you know, to get the blue flowers. It has to do with an enzyme involved in pigment deposition, okay? But that enzyme is sensitive to pH. So what I'm saying is these two plants have the same genes, right, for the enzyme, but they don't have the same phenotype because their environment's different. Is there a cofactor? I think it's iron. Iron is a cofactor for an enzyme in this process of getting the blue flowers, and iron's availability in the soil is affected by the pH of the soil. Therefore, pH affects enzyme activity by affecting availability of a cofactor. It's a really cool story. Yeah?
I think I answered that question.
Well done. What do you need me for? All right, sick. Next, pleiotropy. Remember, all of these distinct things that we're talking about, this is all just why are inheritance patterns complex? Why are they complicated? Because there's more to it than just dominant recessive. All right? So everything we've been talking about has been intended to illustrate that fact. Okay? Pleiotropy. Sometimes a single gene, all right, can affect many different processes. It's been a while since I reviewed my cystic fibrosis effects, but cystic fibrosis has a lot to do with like mucus thickness throughout your body. So a single gene that's involved in either mucus generation or mucus breakdown causes a bunch of different symptoms of cystic fibrosis in your body. So a single gene is affecting a bunch of different phenotypes, and oftentimes genetic disorders arise because of this. One gene that does a bunch of different stuff, that's pleiotropy. So any mutations in that one gene can have a big effect on the organism, because the one gene is involved in many different processes, or I could say aspects of the phenotype. Cool? I got to keep washing my hands. The chalk is hurting my teeth today. Yeah?
Can you explain the origins of the word pleiotropy?
I don't remember. Yeah. I usually have a dictionary of word roots and combining forms at the front of the class, but I didn't. It's in my office right now. Pleio. It's probably Greek. Pleios. Okay, cool. There's that. X chromosomes, Y chromosomes. Let's talk about them. We love them, we know them. X is a big chromosome, Y is a little chromosome. All right? The Y chromosome is the remnant of an X chromosome that now basically what it does is it's got a couple of genes on it that matter. The most important one being the SRY, it's like the sorry gene. All right? It encodes for development of male anatomical features. Okay? But also the Y chromosome is involved in regulating activity of the X chromosome. So as a human, you can have one X, one Y, all right, two X's, okay? Sometimes humans can have two Y chromosomes. Sometimes humans can be XXY or XXX or XYY. That's all due to non-disjunction events. Remember those sort of the discussion we had briefly? You brought it up, actually. Okay? But we're going to talk about X chromosome and the Y chromosome. So why does any of it matter? It matters because the X chromosome has a lot of genes on it. The Y chromosome has like one key gene that we talk about. All right? So if you have two copies of the X chromosome, you've got a backup of all of the genes encoded on the X chromosome. If you only have one copy of the X chromosome, bless you, well then you've only got one copy of all of the genes on the X chromosome. Does that sort of make sense? So that means me personally, I've got an X chromosome and a Y chromosome, right? I've only got one copy of every gene on the X chromosome, all right? And I inherited the X chromosome from the egg cell, from the maternal side, right? I inherited the Y chromosome from the paternal side, all right? So any issues in my phenotype that arise due to mutations on the X chromosome, I can blame my damn mother. And I blame her for everything in my life, so why not that too? I love my mother very much. If you're watching this, Mom, I love you. I love you. She's great. All right? And I think she gave me a pretty solid X chromosome because I don't seem to have any X-linked, disorders currently. I'm into it. All right? Thanks, Mom. Great. Good stuff. So X chromosome, Y chromosome. How we feel so far? Great. Okay. Sometimes there are recessive disorders on the X chromosome. A recessive disorder meaning you need 2 copies of the recessive allele in order to express the disorder, like hemophilia and color blindness. A lot of color blindness is X-linked. Hemophilia, one form of it is X-linked as well. So if you have 2 copies of the X chromosome, you could be carrying the recessive allele for hemophilia and never have hemophilia yourself. All right? But if you have an offspring who has an X chromosome and a Y chromosome, there's a 50% chance that you pass that hemophilia gene onto them. All right? Because if they have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome, they must have inherited the Y chromosome from the paternal side in the sperm cell. Okay? All right? So the gamete that determines whether you have XX or XY is the sperm cell, because the egg cell will always have the X chromosome in it. All right? The maternal side can only donate an X chromosome. The paternal side could donate an X chromosome or a Y chromosome. Okay. So we get complicated patterns of inheritance with characteristics that are encoded on the X chromosome. So in this case, we've got Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. Look at him there. You can tell he would never harm anybody. I'm sure he was a great guy. All right. Queen Victoria. Here she is up here. Queen Victoria didn't have hemophilia. Her husband did not have hemophilia. Their daughter Alice did not have hemophilia. Her husband did not have hemophilia. Their daughter Alexandra did not have hemophilia. Her husband, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, did not have hemophilia. And then all of a sudden, their son has hemophilia. And the Tsar says, this is all your fault, 100%. I don't have hemophilia. And, everybody's like, no, it can't be. And it's 100% her fault. But she couldn't control that. But she never expressed, and her whole line never expressed the hemophilia gene because they had 2 copies of the X chromosome, and one of them had the hemophilia recessive allele, and the other one had the dominant allele. So they were carriers. Okay? Solid so far? Yes.
So, like, all these 3, color blindness, hemophilia, and the muscular dystrophy one, they're more likely to happen in people who have an X and Y chromosome.
Yes, points. That's exactly it. I'm going to repeat that. All right. That felt very phony, the level of enthusiasm I just expressed, but I am actually very stoked that you got to that. All right? It's more likely to get this if you're XY than if you're XX, right? So check it out. Tsar Nicholas II, he only has 1 X chromosome, and he does not have the hemophilia gene. So all of the daughters produced by this coupling event, all the XX individuals, won't have hemophilia. There's a 50% chance they're going to be carriers, but there's 0 chance they're going to have the hemophilia phenotype. But half of their sons would be hemophiliacs. All right? Cool. So here's, there's stuff of life, stuff about this. It's great. Read the book. Okay, cool. Here's how we talk about this. Here's how the shorthand for it. All right? We've got the X chromosome. We've got the Y chromosome. And there will be a superscript after the X. All right? Either an uppercase or a lowercase. The uppercase indicates the dominant allele. The lowercase indicates the recessive allele. So in this case here, we have an XX individual who is heterozygous for hemophilia, being a carrier. The lowercase n is the recessive allele encoding hemophilia in this case. The XY individual here has a dominant X gene for hemophilia. So the sperm cells could be of 2 types. Half the sperm have the dominant allele, half the sperm have a Y chromosome. The eggs Half of them have the dominant allele, half of them have the recessive allele. All right? So what's the probability of an XY offspring receiving, well, having hemophilia? There's only one way it can happen, is this recessive allele here. There is a 1 out of 1 chance that they will receive the Y chromosome if they're XY. All right? So there is a 0.5 chance of them receiving the recessive allele in the egg. Therefore, 0.5 times 1 means that half of XY offspring will have hemophilia. For XX offspring, there's a 0 chance that they will have hemophilia, okay? Because only one way that can happen. So it's what's the probability of receiving a recessive allele from the egg? 0.5. What's the probability of receiving a recessive allele in the sperm? 0. 0.5 times 0 is 0. No chance of it happening. All right? Cool. Good so far? All right. Dosage compensation. All right? So, having 2 copies of, think about with our incomplete dominance example, right? Having 2 copies of the red flower gene let you make more red pigment. All right? So in the heterozygote, you make pink flowers. Remember that? Well, now think about the X chromosome. Some people have 2 X chromosomes, and therefore, they could make twice the amount of gene product as XY individuals.